This is the story of how as many as 175,000 Canadians fought to free the Netherlands, and how more than 7,600 of them never came home. It is also the story of what happened afterward, because 80 years later Dutch schoolchildren still place candles on Canadian graves every Christmas Eve. The Netherlands still ships tulips to Ottawa every single year, and in May of 2025 22 Canadian veterans between the ages of 96 and 105 crossed the Atlantic one more time to find Dutch streets lined with people who refused to forget them. Begin at the end. On the 5th of May, 1945, in a small hotel in the Dutch town of Wageningen called the Hotel de Wereld, which translates as the Hotel of the World, a Canadian lieutenant general named Charles Falck sat across from a German colonel general named Johannes Blaskowitz to arrange the capitulation of every German soldier still standing in the Netherlands. The war in that country ended in that room. And here is the detail almost nobody knows. Nothing was actually signed that day, because no typewriter could be found to prepare the papers, and the real signing happened the next day, May the 6th, in the auditorium of an agricultural college next door. The Netherlands celebrates its Liberation Day on May the 5th, the day the terms were accepted, while the ink itself belongs to May the 6th. History rarely arrives as tidy as the anniversary calendar suggests. To understand how a Canadian general came to sit in that hotel, the story has to travel back 8 months, to an estuary most people have never heard of, a famine that killed tens of thousands, and a princess born in an Ottawa hospital room that legally belonged to no country on earth. The 1st Canadian Army stands as the largest army ever commanded by a Canadian officer, reaching a strength of more than 450,000 men under General Harry Crerar at its peak in 1945. Here comes the first fact that complicates the national mythology, because that army never fought as a purely Canadian force. International composition defined it from the start. Under Crerar served the 2nd Canadian Corps, meaning the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions along with the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, and alongside them fought the 1st British Corps, the 1st Polish Armoured Division, and at various points American, Belgian, and Dutch units as well. In March of 1945 the 1st Canadian Corps arrived from the Italian front under an operation codenamed Gold Flake, and for the first time in history 2 Canadian Corps fought together under a single Canadian Army command. The strategic problem that dragged this army into the Netherlands started not on Dutch soil but with a port. On September 4, 1944, British forces captured Antwerp, one of the great harbors of Europe, almost completely intact. On paper this looked like a logistics miracle, since the Allied armies were still hauling their supplies overland from the Normandy beaches, hundreds of kilometers behind the advancing front, and the entire offensive machine was slowly strangling on its own supply lines. Antwerp came with a catch, though. The port sits roughly 80 kilometers from the open sea, connected to it by the Scheldt estuary, and the Germans held both banks of that estuary. A port without its approaches is a warehouse without roads, where the inventory sits right there, fully stocked, and completely unreachable. Any modern logistics manager who has watched a container ship anchored offshore while a single choke point backs up a global supply chain would recognize the Allied predicament of September 1944 instantly. The Allies owned the warehouse. The Germans owned the only driveway, and every day that driveway stayed closed, the war stretched longer. What the Allied High Command chose to do about that choke point became one of the most criticized decisions of the entire campaign in Northwest Europe. In September 1944, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group that included the 1st Canadian Army, faced a choice between 2 paths. One path meant clearing the Scheldt estuary and opening Antwerp, the unglamorous, muddy, indispensable job. The other meant gambling on Operation Market Garden, the airborne thrust toward Arnhem intended to bounce the Rhine and finish the war by Christmas. Montgomery took the gamble. Market Garden ran from September the 17th to the 25th, 1944, and Market Garden broke at Arnhem. For the Scheldt, the consequences ran deep, because while Allied attention and resources flowed toward the airborne corridor, the German 15th Army slipped across the estuary and dug in. Admiral Ramsay had warned Allied headquarters that the estuary needed clearing, a warning Montgomery reportedly ignored, and in early September Montgomery had even halted resupply to one of his own corps short of the Albert Canal to conserve resources for Market Garden. The American historian Charles B. MacDonald later described the failure to immediately clear the Scheldt as one of the greatest tactical mistakes of the war. Payment for that mistake fell to the 1st Canadian Army, beginning with first attacks on September the 13th and running at full intensity from October the 2nd to November the 8th, 1944. October the 13th, 1944, entered Canadian memory as Black Friday. On that single day the Black Watch, the Royal Highland Regiment of Canada, was virtually wiped out in a failed attack near Wenstrecht. 3 days later, on October the 16th, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division finally seized Wenstrecht itself and closed the land route to the island fortifications beyond. That one division alone would lose 3,650 men in the Scheldt fighting. The battlefield itself fought the attackers. This was polder country, reclaimed land sitting below sea level, laced with dikes and canals, where every road ran as an exposed causeway and every field could be flooded at will. On October the 3rd the Royal Air Force deliberately breached the dikes of Walcheren Island, putting much of the island under the sea to drown the German defenses. Fighting through the flooded Breskin's Pocket earned the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division the nickname of the Water Rats, as its men crossed the Leopold Canal from October the 6th and launched an amphibious assault across the Brakeman Inlet on October the 9th. Roughly 11,000 men of the German 64th Infantry Division defended that pocket under General Major Kurt Eberding, and they surrendered on November the 2nd. Walcheren itself was stormed from November the 1st under Operation Infatuate, with the British 52nd Lowland Division landing from the sea, and the island fell secure by roughly November the 8th. 12,873 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. That was the price the 1st Canadian Army paid for the Battle of the Scheldt, and 6,367 of those casualties were Canadians, with the rest British and Polish. More than 800 Canadians died. In exchange the Army took 41,043 German prisoners, and after minesweepers cleared 267 mines from the estuary under Operation Calendar, the first cargo ship sailed into Antwerp on November the 28th, 1944. That first ship, the Fort Cataraqui, had been built in Canada. Now for the part the commemorative speeches tend to smooth over. Montgomery finally made the Scheldt his top priority on October the 16th, 6 full weeks after Antwerp fell, and on October the 24th the Field Marshal visited the 3rd Canadian Division headquarters and criticized the Canadians for the slowness of their advance. Consider the sequence there. The delay flowed substantially from Montgomery's own priorities, and the Army being criticized was fighting under strength, because Canada's volunteer-only overseas service policy had produced a reinforcement crisis so severe that it detonated a political scandal at home, with Canada's defense minister resigning in November 1944. Infantry battalions bleeding out in the polders could not be refilled fast enough, and the commander who had starved the operation of priority was lecturing those battalions about speed. The Scheldt has been called an unnecessarily difficult victory and a forgotten one, overlooked by the Allied commanders at the time and by much of the historiography afterward, and the Dutch gave that judgment cinematic form in 2020 with a feature film titled, precisely, The Forgotten Battle. Whether the delay actually prolonged the war remains an open argument among historians. What nobody disputes is the arithmetic, because Antwerp fell on September the 4th and opened on November the 28th, and the German decision to hold the Scheldt bought the Reich nearly 3 months of Allied supply paralysis at the cost of an army of prisoners. With the Scheldt cleared, the front in the Netherlands froze along the great rivers in what Canadian soldiers called the Winter on the Maas, a static season of patrols, raids, and alarms, including the skirmish at Kapellschwier, while the crisis of the Ardennes played out to the south. North of those rivers, in the occupied western Netherlands, a different kind of battle was already underway, and its victims were civilians. Back in September 1944, the Dutch government in exile had called a national railway strike to support Operation Market Garden, and the occupation authorities answered with collective punishment. Early in October 1944, the German administration imposed an embargo on food transport to the Western Netherlands. Then came a winter of exceptional cold that froze the canals solid, which meant the barges that might have moved food could not move at all, and 4 years of occupation had already hollowed out the country's reserves. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht found themselves sealed inside a starvation zone. The Dutch call it the hunger winter. In English, the hunger winter. Official rations in the West collapsed to somewhere between 400 and 800 calories per day, and by late April 1945 they had fallen as low as 364 calories, which amounts to less than a fifth of what an adult needs. Roughly 4.5 million people lived inside that hunger. People ate sugar beets. People dug up tulip bulbs, the national flower, and boiled them for dinner. Among the starving was a teenage girl in the Arnhem area named Audrey Hepburn, who survived the famine and carried its physical marks into a Hollywood career. Counting the dead of the hunger winter demands precision, because the numbers swing enormously depending on what gets counted, and this episode refuses to smooth over that variance. The figure most commonly cited for the famine runs somewhere between 18 and 22,000 dead from November 1944 to May 1945. At the narrow end, the Dutch Central Statistics Bureau recorded about 8,300 deaths directly from hunger, a count that leaves out the far larger number of people whose malnutrition turned a treatable illness fatal. At the widest lens, a 2017 demographic study by Camper and colleagues calculated close to 91,000 war-related excess deaths across the Netherlands between January 1944 and July 1945, and buried in that study sits a finding that cuts against the standard narrative, because almost half of those excess deaths occurred outside the famine-stricken West. History remembers the hunger winter as a story about Amsterdam and Rotterdam. The demographic record says the dying was national. That was the country the 1st Canadian Army now prepared to liberate, a nation where the enemy held the cities held the starving, and any assault risked killing the very people it was meant to save. Before the Netherlands could be freed, the German position west of the Rhine had to be broken, which meant the Canadian road back into the Netherlands ran, strangely enough, through Germany itself. Operation Veritable opened on February 8, 1945, driving southeast from the Nijmegen salient through the Reichswald forest toward the Rhine, with the British 30th Corps fighting under Canadian Army command. The preparation reached apocalyptic proportions by the standards of the Western Front, with a barrage from 1,034 guns, the largest British barrage since El Alamein, and more than 750 Royal Air Force bombers striking the towns of Cleve and Gotch on February 7. Then the Germans blew the Ruhr dams and flooded the battlefield, and Veritable turned into a fight waged in freezing water and mud, where the amphibious vehicles of the water rats once again counted for more than tanks. Operation Blockbuster followed from February 26 to March 10, with the 2nd Canadian Corps grinding through the Hochwald Gap toward Xanten. On the first day of Blockbuster, at a hamlet called Mushoff, Sergeant Aubrey Cozens of the Queen's Own Rifles earned the Victoria Cross. Cozens never lived to receive it. 15,634 men killed, wounded, and missing. That was the Rhineland bill for the 1st Canadian Army, and 5,304 of them were Canadian. The Rhine crossings came on March 23, with the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade crossing at Ries under British command and the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion dropping near Wesel, where a medical orderly named Corporal Frederick Topham earned another Victoria Cross. The river line was broken, the way into the occupied Netherlands lay open, and the 1st Canadian Army, now with both Canadian Corps in the line, wheeled north and west. What followed ranks among the fastest sequences of city liberations in the entire Western European War, and the dates land like drumbeats. April 10 brought Deventer. April 11 saw Operation Cannon Shot put the Canadian Corps across the Isle River, driving toward Apeldoorn. April the 12th opened the assault on Arnhem, codenamed Operation Anger, the second battle for the city that had broken Market Garden, led by the British 49th West Riding Division with the 5th Canadian Armoured Division in support, and Arnhem was cleared by April the 14th. From April the 13th to the 16th, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division fought the Battle of Groningen in the far north. Leeuwarden fell free on April the 15th, and Apeldoorn followed on the 17th. On April the 12th, Canadian soldiers in a universal carrier rolled into a place called Westerbork, the transit camp through which approximately 100,000 Jews, along with several hundred Sinti and Roma, had been deported to the death camps of the East. Liberating the Netherlands was never only about territory. One detail from these weeks deserves far more attention than it usually receives, because it reveals the moral core of the campaign. Fighting through populated Dutch towns in April 1945, the Canadians deliberately restricted their own artillery and air support to spare civilians, a self-imposed handicap that pushed Canadian casualties upward. The 1st Canadian Division alone suffered more than 500 casualties between April the 11th and 17th, over 100 of them fatal. Week after week, town after town, Canadian commanders accepted dead Canadians in exchange for living Dutch civilians, and that choice helps explain what happened in Dutch memory afterward. Then there is Zwolle, because the liberation of Zwolle belongs, in its essentials, to one man. Private Leo Major of Le Regiment de la Chaudière was a French-Canadian sniper who had lost the use of one eye earlier in the war and refused to be sent home. On the night of April the 13th into the 14th, 1945, Major entered Zwolle on a two-man reconnaissance with his friend Corporal Wilfred Arsenault, and Arsenault was killed almost at once. What Major did next became legend. Alone through the night, Major harassed the German garrison, made contact with the Dutch resistance, and set fire to the Gestapo headquarters, and by morning the Germans had withdrawn from the city, which meant the planned Canadian artillery bombardment of Zwolle, with everything it would have destroyed, was cancelled. Major's Distinguished Conduct Medal citation, dated May 20, 1945, records that, undaunted by the death of a friend and comrade, he continued to patrol alone for 6 hours, contacting the underground. Honesty about the record requires a caveat here, because parts of the popular telling remain contested. Other units, among them the 7th Reconnaissance Regiment and the Regina Rifles, also claimed entries into Zwolle. Resistance fighters from Almelo made claims of their own. Estimates of the garrison's strength range from a few hundred to more than 1,500 men, and a Dutch museum conservator named Dirk Stott has publicly questioned elements of the story. The medal citation stands as the primary source anchor, and the citation alone reads as extraordinary. Major went on to become the only Canadian awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal in 2 separate wars, first the Second World War and then Korea. Zwolle made Leo Major an honorary citizen in 2005, and when Major died on October 12, 2008, the city that never met him in daylight mourned him as one of its own. The mayor of Zwolle put it in 6 words, calling him a symbol of our freedom. By the end of April the German forces in the west of the country had been pushed back to the Grebe line, running from Wageningen through Amersfoort to the North Sea, and behind that line lay the starving cities. At that moment the 1st Canadian Army did something armies almost never do on the edge of victory. The whole advance stopped. That halt at the Grebe line turned this campaign into something rare in military history, a liberation completed by negotiation and bread rather than by bombardment. The reasoning behind the halt carried a brutal clarity. The occupied West was polder country, much of it below sea level, and a final assault risked the Germans blowing the dikes, drowning the land, and condemning millions of already starving civilians. More than 1,000 Canadians had already died in April 1945 fighting an enemy that was plainly finished, and pushing into Amsterdam and Rotterdam might have won a battle while killing the country. Instead, the two sides talked. On April 2 the Reich Commissioner governing the occupied Netherlands signaled willingness to negotiate, and by April 12 an understanding was taking shape, one where the Allies would halt at the Greb Line and the occupation authorities would permit food to reach the starving cities. Prince Bernhard, Commander-in-Chief of the Dutch Interior Forces, briefed General Eisenhower, while the Dutch Prime Minister in exile briefed the British Prime Minister. Eisenhower authorized planning on April the 23rd, and the work fell to a Royal Air Force Air Commodore named Andrew Geddes. A village schoolhouse in Achterveld hosted the negotiations themselves, with the first German-Allied meeting on April the 28th, Prince Bernhard present in the room, a higher-level session on April the 30th, and final agreement reached in the first days of May. On April the 30th, the Reich Commissioner formally ordered German forces to hold their fire against the food flights. Then came the bombers, carrying no bombs. Operation Manna belonged to the Royal Air Force, running from April the 29th to the 7th or 8th of May and dropping roughly 7,000 tons of food, beginning with 242 Lancasters on the first day. One of those aircraft, a test flight nicknamed Bad Penny, flew before the German guarantee had even been formalized, and the crews included Australians of 460 Squadron and Poles of 300 Squadron. Operation Chowhound belonged to the United States Army Air Forces, running from May the 1st to the 8th and delivering roughly 4,000 tons, with American records specifying about 3,770 tons across 2,268 sorties by B-17s, the same aircraft type that had burned German cities, now flying grocery runs. Operation Faust completed the trio from May the 2nd to the 9th, with Canadian Army trucks driving food straight across the Greb Line into occupied territory at a rate of about 1,000 tons a day, roughly 7,000 tons in all. Around 18,000 tons of food arrived in roughly 11 days. The aircraft came in at 150 meters, some as low as 50 feet, over cities where anti-aircraft crews stood by their guns and, apart from a few scattered bursts of small arms fire, held the truce. Below them, Dutch civilians spelled out messages in tulips and rocks large enough to read from a bomber. "Many thanks," the field said. "Thank you." The end arrived in a rush of dates that history has partly tangled together, so this script will keep them straight. On May the 4th, 1945, at Lüneburg Heath in Germany, Field Marshal Montgomery accepted the surrender of all German forces in Northwest Europe, covering the Netherlands, Northwest Germany, and Denmark, and Canadian units received ceasefire orders effective 8 o'clock the following morning. May the 5th, 1945, became the day the Netherlands celebrates as Liberation Day. At the Hotel de Wereld in Wageningen, Lieutenant General Charles Foulkes of the 1st Canadian Corps met Colonel General Johannes Blaskowitz, the German commander-in-chief in the Netherlands, to arrange the capitulation of German forces in the country. This was a subsidiary arrangement under Montgomery's Lüneburg surrender rather than a separate national surrender, and it was not the end of the war in Europe either, since the general German surrender would be signed at Reims on May the 7th and ratified in Berlin on May the 8th. Prince Bernhard attended, as did a Canadian brigadier named George Kitching. Blaskowitz did not come at first, sending instead his chief of staff, Generalleutnant Paul Reichelt, and only after being told to appear in person did Blaskowitz arrive, at around 4 in the afternoon. Amsterdam was liberated that same day, and Utrecht followed on the 7th. May the 6th brought the actual signing. No formal document had been executed on the 5th, reportedly because no typewriter was available to prepare it, and Blaskowitz had asked for 24 hours. The capitulation was signed on May the 6th in the auditorium of the Agricultural College next door to the hotel. A national holiday commemorates the handshake, while the signature belongs to the following day. One anecdote from that room survives through the Canadian historian Tim Cook. Foulkes reportedly warned the German delegation that refusing immediate food aid to the Dutch population would amount to a war crime. Foulkes's own nephew later recalled that his uncle was appalled by what the Canadians discovered at the German headquarters, where paintings, French wine, and chocolate sat hoarded in a command post surrounded by a nation that had been eating tulip bulbs. More than 7,600 Canadians died in the campaign to liberate the Netherlands. Veterans Affairs Canada and the Canadian War Museum carry that figure, and it holds true, but only with its definition attached, and this episode attaches definitions. The 7,600 figure covers the whole campaign, roughly September 1944 to May 8, 1945, and it includes soldiers, sailors, and airmen buried in cemeteries stretching from Oud-Gem in Belgium to Rheinberg in Germany. In plain terms, it counts Canadians who died freeing the Netherlands, including those killed on Belgian and German soil doing it. The Dutch Institute for War Documentation frames the ledger differently, attributing about 4,100 deaths to Canada out of roughly 13,000 Allied soldiers who died in battle on Dutch soil between mid-September 1944 and May 1945. Both numbers hold up under their own rules. One counts a campaign, and the other counts a country. The full Dutch ledger reads darker still. Roughly 23,000 Dutch civilians died from acts of war during the liberation period. German military dead in the Netherlands likely ran between 15 and 20,000. Britain lost about 6,700 dead on Dutch soil, the United States 1,135, and Poland 630. Across the whole war, the Netherlands lost approximately 301,000 people, including about 104,000 murdered in the Holocaust, many of them deported through the same Westerbork camp the Canadians overran in April. Over 1,000 Canadians died in April 1945 alone, the final full month of a war that was already decided. The official Canadian historian, Colonel C. P. Stacey, refused to let that fact soften, writing that no one should misconceive the severity of the fighting during those final months, when, in the twilight of the gods, the defenders of the Reich displayed the recklessness of fanaticism and the courage of despair. The bond between the two countries did not begin with the liberation. It began 3 years earlier in an Ottawa maternity ward, and it comes wrapped in one of the most persistent myths in Canadian popular history, a myth this episode is going to correct. In June 1940, with the Netherlands overrun, the Dutch Crown Princess and her 2 daughters took refuge in Ottawa, settling at a residence called Stornoway, while the Dutch Queen led the government in exile from Britain and the Crown Princess's husband, Prince Bernhard, served with the Royal Air Force. January 1943 brought the moment that would bind the two nations. The Crown Princess entered the Ottawa Civic Hospital on the 18th, and on January the 19th, 1943, a princess was born. Margriet became the first member of the House of Orange-Nassau ever born outside the Netherlands, and as of 2020 she remained the only royal princess born in North America. Now for the myth. The popular version claims the hospital room was declared Dutch soil. Nothing of the kind happened, and the truth runs both stranger and cleverer. Citizenship law created the problem, because under birthright citizenship a child born on Canadian territory could acquire status as a British subject, entangling a future member of the Dutch royal house, and the line of succession itself, in foreign nationality. The solution came from a legal advisor at Canada's Department of External Affairs named John Erskine Read, with legislation drafted by a team under the Deputy Minister of Justice, Frederick Varco, in the form of a proclamation under the War Measures Act declaring the maternity suite temporarily extraterritorial. Not Dutch territory. No territory at all. The room belonged, legally, to no jurisdiction whatsoever, a roaming bubble of legal nowhere, so that the baby would be born solely a Dutch citizen through her parents' blood, untouched by the soil beneath the hospital. The instinct behind the myth makes sense, because it springs from the same instinct that makes people believe an embassy stands on the soil of the country it represents. In both cases the reality is a legal fiction rather than a land transfer, since the ground never changes owners and the law simply agrees to look away. Ottawa never gave the Netherlands a room. Ottawa made a room vanish from the map. The baby was christened at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Ottawa on June 29, 1943, with godparents who reveal how symbolically loaded this birth had become, among them the American president and, collectively, the entire Dutch merchant marine. The Crown Princess said it herself, promising that her baby would always be a link with Canada, not only for her own family but for the Netherlands. In August 1945, mother and daughters went home to a liberated country. In the fall of 1945, the Crown Princess sent Canada a gift of 100,000 tulip bulbs. 20,500 more followed in 1946, with a request that some be planted at the Ottawa Civic Hospital where Margaret was born, and a pledge that the gift would arrive every year. It still does. 8 decades on, the Netherlands ships thousands of tulip bulbs to Ottawa annually, with sources putting the modern figure between 10 and 20,000, planted in a dedicated gift bed in Commissioners Park and at the hospital campus. Those tulips grew into something far bigger. An Ottawa-based photographer, an immigrant who had arrived in 1937 and photographed the first tulips on Parliament Hill in 1949, proposed a festival in 1952, and in 1953 the Ottawa Board of Trade staged the first Canadian Tulip Festival with more than 750,000 tulips in bloom. Today it claims the title of largest tulip festival in the world, with over 1 million tulips and on the order of 650,000 visitors a year. The Queen who had sent the first bulbs returned to see them in 1967. In 2002, for the festival's 50th anniversary, Princess Margaret herself, the child from the room that belonged to no country, unveiled a monument in Commissioners Park called the Man with Two Hats, a bronze figure standing 4.6 meters tall, created by a Dutch sculptor, holding one hat in each raised hand. Its twin had been unveiled 2 years earlier, in 2000, in the liberated city of Apeldoorn. 2 identical statues, one in each country, 4,000 kilometers apart, carrying war and peace, and 2 nations holding the same memory. The Canadians who never came home lie mostly in 3 Dutch cemeteries, and what the Dutch have done with those cemeteries forms the heart of this story's second half. Groesbeek Canadian War Cemetery, near Nijmegen, holds 2,619 burials, 2,338 of them Canadian, the largest concentration of Canadian war dead in the Netherlands, plus a memorial to roughly 1,000 missing. Groesbeek exists in its present form because of a deliberate order, since General Crerar directed that Canadian dead not be buried in German soil, and the men killed in the Rhineland were carried back across the border and reinterred in the Netherlands. Sergeant Aubrey Cozens, the Victoria Cross winner of Mushoff, lies there, and the cemetery opened on May 4, 1947. Holton Canadian War Cemetery holds 1,393 Commonwealth burials, roughly 1,350 of them Canadian, most from the final drive of April and May 1945. Bergen-op Zoom Canadian War Cemetery holds 1,118 burials, 968 of them Canadian, largely the dead of the Scheldt. Then comes what happens around those headstones. Every May 4th, the Netherlands falls silent for its Remembrance Day, and every May 5th it celebrates Liberation Day. At Holton, a tradition introduced in 1991 by a Finnish-born resident grew into something no one planned, because since 1995 local schoolchildren have placed a burning candle on every single grave on Christmas Eve, a practice that has since spread to more than 110 sites across the Netherlands. At Groesbeek, a Dutch foundation called Faces to Graves, founded on May 19, 2015, has set itself the task of researching and publishing a life story, with a photograph wherever one can be found, for every Canadian buried there, building a digital monument grave by grave. Its Faces of Groesbeek event, held every 2 years, places each soldier's photograph against his headstone, and Princess Margaret visited in 2023. An umbrella foundation called Canadian War Graves Nederland was established in 2018 and formalized its partnership with the Dutch War Graves organization in July 2019. One point of precision belongs here, because accuracy is the house rule. The famous one family per grave formal adoption registry with a waiting list belongs to the American Cemetery at Margareton. The Canadian cemeteries are better described as receiving collective community care, with schools, families, and foundations tending graves and reconstructing lives, rather than a documented one-tune adoption system. the devotion stands beyond question. The paperwork model differs. Here the episode challenges its own premise, because the rule of this channel says contested history gets documented, not decorated. The months after May 1945 live in Dutch memory as the Canadian summer, a season of dances, celebrations, and romances that culminated in the Dutch Queen's birthday festivities in late August. The affection was real, and the receipts are demographic. 1,886 Dutch women married Canadian soldiers and emigrated to Canada, bringing 428 children with them, which made them the second-largest national contingent of Canadian war brides after the roughly 45,000 British, and the Canadian government paid their passage. The Dutch even wrote a hit song about it, called Trees heeft een Canadees, meaning trees has a Canadian. The historian Michiel Horn, who has studied the Canadian Army's occupation months more closely than almost anyone, documents the other side of that ledger, recording unwanted pregnancies, illegitimate births, venereal disease, and genuine Dutch resentment as Dutchmen watched foreign soldiers court their women and carry them off across an ocean. German propaganda had smeared Canadian conduct before the liberators even arrived. Horn takes care to note that reliable figures are hard to come by, and Horn's summary judgment lands as the honest one, holding that the Canadians were no saints, just mostly young men who had fought, faced death, and lived. A 2023 academic symposium at Canada's Royal Military College put an institutional stamp on the same point, concluding that the feeling of mutual respect is undoubtedly real but does not tell the whole story, since tensions existed between the Canadian Army and the Dutch government both during and after the war. Not every Dutch memory of liberation glows warm either, because around Walcheren, where Allied bombs breached the dikes in October 1944 and the sea took years to push back out, some residents remember the flooding before they remember the freedom. The relationship survived the friction, and afterward it kept growing. Of roughly 500,000 Dutch citizens who emigrated between the late 1940s and the 1970s, approximately 185,000, a full 37%, chose Canada, which made the Netherlands the fifth largest source of immigrants to Canada between 1946 and 1968, with the peak year of 1952 alone bringing around 21,000 people. By the 2016 census, more than 1.1 million Canadians claimed Dutch origins. A country of tulip growers and drain polders looked at the nation that had freed it and decided, by the hundreds of thousands, to become part of it. Human threads run through all the decades since. A Dutch woman whose Apeldoorn house was destroyed in the same bombardment of April 15, 1945, that killed a Canadian corporal named Harry Brott later wrote to the soldier's widow, and the two women corresponded for decades. A 7-year-old Apeldoorn girl made an honorary captain by the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals kept her insignia sweater for 74 years before donating it to posterity in 2018. Lieutenant General Fawkes, the man from the Hotel de Wereld, rests in Ottawa's Beechwood Cemetery, where Princess Margriet unveiled a memorial plaque in 2022. In May 2025, on the 80th anniversary, the story came full circle. Canada sent an official delegation of roughly 120 people to the Netherlands, among them 22 veterans of the Second World War aged 96 to 105, and crowds lined the routes to meet them. A ceremony at Grosbeek opened the week on May 2, a liberation parade rolled through Apeldoorn on May 3 with 20 of the veterans taking part, a ceremony at Holten on May 4 featured a symbolic drop of 15,000 Canadian poppies, and the national ceremony at Wageningen on May 5 returned to the town of the surrender exactly 80 years to the day. Canada's Governor-General laid a wreath at Holten and met the Dutch King, the Dutch Prime Minister, and Princess Margriet, while more than 1,000 Canadian students traveled to take part and, back home, the CN Tower burned as a beacon of peace. In all likelihood it stands as one of the last great anniversaries with living liberators present, men now well past their 100-year, standing in towns that still teach their names. This is where the story ends, and the tensions stay standing. More than 7,600 Canadians died so that the Netherlands could be free, and the definition of that number is still argued between Ottawa and Amsterdam. The battle that opened Antwerp was won by an army its own field marshal had deprioritized and then criticized for slowness. The final month of fighting killed over 1,000 Canadians in a war already decided, and the decision to stop at the Grebe line, feeding the enemy-held cities instead of storming them, saved a nation at the price of leaving it occupied for one more hungry week. The princess at the center of the bond was born in a room that belonged to no country. The Liberation Summer produced both marriages and resentments, and the historians who look closest insist on keeping both. None of these tensions resolve, and none of them need to. 80 years on, the tulips still arrive in Ottawa every autumn, the candles still burn on the graves at Holton every Christmas Eve, and the town of Zwolle still calls a one-eyed private from Montreal its honorary citizen. Nations forget almost everything. The Netherlands decided, deliberately and annually, to become the exception, and the country that freed the Netherlands was never forgotten, because the Dutch turned remembering into an institution, and institutions outlive everyone who built them.